Hello, everyone, and welcome to Z Talk. Today, we have a very interesting conversation, which I'll let my colleague Dean Morrison, who will be my co-host in this episode. So I'll let him, kind of do the thunder here. I'll just, be quiet because I'm really eager to listen to what's about to go on here. So, Dean, my friend, as usual, thank you for being on this show, and obviously for your support and friendship over our 25 plus years.
My pleasure, Henry. And I think this is my third appearance on the show, so
Yep.
I'm not sure anybody has got 3 episodes in. So.
You have one show and then 2. This is your second co-host.
That's it. Exactly. I can't get enough. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Jack Carroll on beyond Jack's expertise in the subject matter we're going to talk about. Jack and I date back to fraternity brothers at Syracuse University back in 1978. And Jack was, I believe, the second president of the fraternity. So at an early stage, he was exhibiting leadership qualities. So we've kind of reintroduced ourselves, and I've had a chance to talk to him a few times, and I've read his book, Battle Ready Leadership Handbook. And so Jack is the founder and lead facilitator of Battle Ready Leadership, which is a leadership training business designed to inspire and motivate businesses and their executives to set and reach their goals. Battle Ready Leadership customizes leadership summits for businesses of all size. Jack was a former CEO of a regional marketing and advertising firm and has more than 30 years experience. He's taught business communications at the University of Pittsburgh's Katz School of Business. So, Jack, a pleasure.
Welcome,
wanted
Jack.
Wanted to start off with a question regarding technology, since this is actually a technology podcast. And in just doing some reading, it amazed me how technology really made the American Civil War the first industrial modern war. Hot air balloons, submarines, machine guns, photography rather than paintings, the use of the telegraph, the use of railroads. All of these were important. How would you say that these technologies were important in deciding the outcome of the Civil War?
Well, thanks, Dean. It's really nice to be here. And by the way, the leadership that I exhibited for the fraternity back in the old days, I hope you won't judge me on but we'll talk about that later. But it's a fascinating subject when you talk about technology in the American Civil War. And you ask the question, what kind of an impact did it have on the outcome? Certainly on the Battle of Gettysburg. But I think the real, effect that technology had was on the tremendous number of casualties that you saw during the American Civil War. I think there was a time, we talk a lot about a time of crisis, and in that time of crisis, it brings about change, sort of what we're dealing with today. And that time of change really is meant to be, I believe, a time of opportunity for people who understand and can get it right. So I think what happened during the American Civil War is the technology really greatly kind of outdistanced the tactics that were being used by the leadership of the military at that point in time. I understand the military, the leadership, they're all trained at West Point, or most of them, or VMI or other, prestigious military schools. But the tactics they used went back to Napoleon's time, 50 years prior to that. And when I say that, they were used to dealing with weapons that weren't nearly as modern as they were during the time of the Civil War. So you had, at that time, they had these muskets that weren't rifled and so on previously. So these tactics that you saw of these geometric, these formations of soldiers walking shoulder to shoulder into battle and charging a position. Back in the day, during Napoleon's time, with inferior weapons, they could, with a range of perhaps 100 and 150 yards, you could walk right up into a position and charge. Whereas the new weapons of the Civil War, starting with the rifled musket, which was a new development just prior to the war, and a new form of bullets called the Minet ball, or mini ball as it became more Americanized. These weapons had a range of as much as 500 or 600 yards. So for some unexplained reason, the troops still sort of used these tactics that were used to being used prior to that. And so you saw so many instances of troops being slaughtered on a battlefield from long distance, and as they continued to move forward and so on. So it was just the technology, I would say, impacted the outcomes of battles. But the reason we saw so many casualties during the American Civil War, nearly 600,000 dead, was because, again, the tactics did not really keep up with the technology. And as you mentioned, there were a lot of things going on. You mentioned the railroads, and that played a very important role, especially in the South. It was easy for these Southern troops to sort of reinforce themselves, moving from place to place. So if there was a battle going on in a northern part of Virginia, they could quickly get troops from 100 miles away if necessary, and they used that to their advantage. So technology was definitely something that played a major role during the American Civil War, and I think that really is what really led to the enormous number of casualties. I think the leadership at that point in time did not change, did not look for opportunities to do things differently, and so on. And I think that was a very graphic example of what happens when you don't really necessarily have a full understanding of the changes that are taking place, and you continue to use old tactics.
Henry, did you have a question?
No, I'm just obviously listening and trying to see. I want to see that perspective that I read about, on your website about, how these battles and kind of came together, but more importantly, what, I guess a lot of leadership was driven out of these battles and examples of leadership. And I think that's something I'm very intrigued about, is to see, when these battles were occurring and these generals in all different ranks, fighting, there have to be, several, or if not numerous, examples of leadership, whether it was, a technology-driven leadership or just, leadership of men to achieve goals. So I want to, hear that, your view of, what leadership was kind of born in and part of this war.
Yeah, Henry, I think one of the things that's great about the Battle of Gettysburg is it gives you a lot of opportunities to study both really effective leadership and also rather unsuccessful leadership that was done by, happened to be on either side of this battle. The Union Army, for some reason, really got their act together in the Battle of Gettysburg. You have to understand that prior to Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee and his chief lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, they had led what was still considered to be one of the greatest military campaigns in American history. They crushed huge Union armies in battle after battle. And they always seemed to be making the right decisions. And the Union command really seemed to be making all the big mistakes going into battle. And for some reason, that flip-flopped in Gettysburg. And there were a number of reasons for that, which we probably don't have time to get into now, but there were circumstances that led to changes in leadership and changes in attitudes even. So when we talk about leadership at Gettysburg, I always like to talk about, a lot of it has to do with stepping up in a time of crisis. And starting really with the commanding general, I call him the CEO of the Union Army, and that's George Gordon Meade. Meade had to take charge during a very obvious time of crisis. And there's kind of an interesting story about George Meade, even when he took command of the Union Army. He was ordered to take command of the Army only 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg actually took place. Abraham Lincoln sort of forced the resignation of Meade's predecessor, Joseph Hooker, just a couple of days before. And the way this all came down is really kind of interesting. On the 28th of June, just a couple of days before the battle, Meade was bivouacked with his troops around Frederick, Maryland. And at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, a young captain comes into his tent with a message. And he says, General Meade, I'm afraid I'm here to give you some trouble. And Meade, not knowing what was going on, he had no idea, about the order or anything else. And he thought he was being arrested for some kind of an infraction on the battlefield or something else. So Meade jumps out of bed and he says, look, if I'm being arrested, I want you to know I have a clear conscience. And the young captain looked at him and said, General Meade, I'm afraid I've got much worse news than that. You've been made commander of the Union Army. And so,
that's a good one.
The point is that George Meade, I will call him one of the most underrated generals in American history. You don't hear a lot about him. When people talk about the command of these two armies, the Confederates and the Union Army and so on, everyone talks about Robert E. Lee, or at least everyone knows that Robert E. Lee was at Gettysburg. I know a lot of people, if you ask them who was the Union commander, they'll tell you Ulysses Grant was the commander at Gettysburg. So Meade was just an interesting commander because he really, his personality was such. He was rather academic, kind of bookish. He was a former engineer, extremely organized. And when he took command of the Army, he really did a tremendous job of pulling the Army together and organizing them and even solidifying lines of communication and empowering his lieutenants. That was one of the things that I think Meade did most effectively at Gettysburg was he empowered his subordinates, in particular 3 or 4 generals, to really make some decisions during the battle, whereas Robert E. Lee did just the opposite. Lee kind of centralized everything. He was kind of an autocratic leader when he got to Gettysburg. He kind of, everything was centralized and everything had to go through him, and he was making decisions essentially on his own. Whereas Meade was much more of, I call him the ultimate team builder, because he really did have kind of a democratic way of doing things in terms of his leadership style. So that's where it kind of begins when you talk about leadership at Gettysburg. But there are so many amazing stories of other commanders and junior commanders that really stepped up in a time of crisis. And so when I talk to businesses, I talk about how leadership can come from any part of an organization. You don't have to have a C-level title or even a vice president or management title to be able to take leadership in situations. And there were so many instances of that during the Battle of Gettysburg. Some of the most fascinating stories and more heroic stories, and the ones that people like to read about, are stories of leadership that took place from sort of the younger commanders that stepped in at a time when they were needed. So courageous leadership is certainly something that that was part of the battle. Again, you have great instances of successful leadership styles and unsuccessful leadership styles at Gettysburg. And one of the things about Meade that I just want to kind of also mention was much of the time that he spent giving orders that first day of the battle, he had to do remotely, just like we're learning to do now. You didn't have everybody together in one place. He had the cavalry in Gettysburg. He had 3 other Union Corps on their way to Pennsylvania from Maryland, and Meade stayed back. And so remotely, he was sending out these orders and written communication and organizing his men from in a remote manner, which I thought was really something. So just to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think when you talk about leadership, it kind of starts at the top and works its way down. I think all of the Union commanders, I think, had an understanding of what the general order was by George Meade. And the general order was to locate Robert E. Lee's army, engage him, and hold him in place until the rest of the Union Army could be, brought up from Maryland and do battle with Lee.
Jack, let me ask you, as you talk to business leaders, across the country and use the Battle of Gettysburg as an example for your lesson, what are some of the lessons that can be drawn, that can be applied to modern corporate leadership? What are some of your favorite examples of things that occurred there that can be applied today without much change in the structure of how they acted at that time.
Well, I guess one of my favorite lessons, I guess, and one of the things that I talk about, and I talk about all kinds of different things in terms of of how you get people to follow you. How do they go into battle? That was one of the things that always fascinated me. With, you know, when I got there and I learned more about the battle, and even people that I've taken up there from time to time, they'll ask the question, why did they do this? You know, why did they march into this position, or why did they do this? I mean, they knew that there was a pretty good chance that they were going to be wiped out in some situations. And it was really a case of, you know, when you ask people in the military, and I think even some of the people that I've known who have been in sports professionally and so on, they'll tell you that, you know, they do it for the person on the left of them and the person on the right of them. They feel that they're in this together, you know, and you just don't want to let that person down under any circumstances. So you kind of get into a certain kind of a narcosis that overtakes a soldier sometimes when they're in battle. They don't worry so much about their own mortality anymore and their lives. They worry about the group as a whole. And I think that's a lesson that I really like to kind of convey to businesses. I mean, not necessarily to lay your life on the line, but to have that same mentality of understanding that, you know, we're all in this together. It's no longer just about us as individuals. You know, I need that person if I'm going to be successful, and they need me, or else we're just not going to be able to accomplish this. So that's one of the things that I really like to highlight. And if we have a couple of seconds, I think one of the types of leadership that I like to talk about, because he's part of the Gettysburg story, and I talk a lot about Abraham Lincoln and his time as president of the United States. And I think Lincoln was the ultimate transformational leader. Now, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean to be a transformational leader? So I kind of break that down into three areas. One is transformational leader is able to selectively kind of let go of some of the past. They don't necessarily wipe out the past altogether, but they look for ways that, you know, some of the old conventions of the past maybe aren't applicable anymore, right, just as we're finding out today. The second thing they do is they manage the present, the present, and they do that the best they can. And then in addition to that, they embrace the future. So when I talk about Lincoln, I kind of take it back to the Gettysburg Address. And Lincoln, to me, you know, I always kind of joke that the Gettysburg Address, in my opinion, is kind of like the closest thing we have to scripture in this secular society of ours. You know, it just is something that you can recite and think about, and it just touches you in so many ways. So Lincoln had a way of really covering those three things in the Gettysburg Address. I won't recite the whole thing for you, but I'll point out certain passages that I think apply to all three of those things in terms of, one is letting go of the conventions of the past. And that's the beginning of the Gettysburg Address. He says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's telling us that this is what we're meant to be, what we're supposed to be. Then he goes on to say, you know, now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, you know, and can long endure. So he's now telling us that we're tested. We're being tested, that what we are supposed to be is being tested. You know, it's kind of familiar with where we are today with the COVID situation and everything else. You know, we're being tested. And then finally, he gets into, at the end, he talks about embracing the future. And he says, we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln, I think, nailed it, you know, in terms of the transformational period in the Gettysburg Address, because he then sort of challenged us to say, this is where we need to be. This is who we are. This is what we're dealing with now, and this is where we need to go. And I think any leader, if they can cover those areas with their team, they're going to have people that are pretty inspired to move forward.
That's amazing, and I can relate. I'm ex-military. I'm a veteran. I was in the U.S. Air Force. So when you made that comment about military and how they are. It is a mindset that I guess when you're in the military you can understand it because you're living it, and you're fighting for your brother or sister, on your left and right side, and you follow the orders, and so you have to have great leaders that are inspiring you, so that you can get through difficult tasks. I mean, in the case of Gettysburg, obviously it was this is life and death. When you're in a sales organization, it's not life and death. It could be for the company itself, but
Sure.
but the people. But it's that same framework of kind of like a work ethic that kind of hit home when you mentioned that.
I think sometimes struggling for market share in business is a life and death situation. It's just like staying alive on a battlefield.
Exactly.
You've got to stay alive in the industry that you're in.
And I love one of the quotes here on your website. It says, at Gettysburg in 1863, 3 days changed history. Imagine what 3 days in Gettysburg can do for your business. And that caught my eye. So, Dina, I have to read the book now.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I'll get you the book.
I have to read that book.
We still have a few minutes remaining, and it's just like, this is such a timely subject. I mean, in the news just the other day, as President Trump is thinking about addressing the Republican convention from Gettysburg, and a lot of interest, obviously, and in that particular situation. Jack, Dr. Roach of Penn State wrote in your book, in the introduction, she says that the book was not a compilation of history lessons, but it was an interesting way of looking at lessons learned from history. And so in light of, the fact that Gettysburg is top of our mind right now, and in light of the situation involving the killing of George Floyd, which sparked widespread protests and reignited efforts to remove Confederate and other statues viewed as symbols of slavery and racism. What do you say to those who argue that the removal of such statues dishonors the memory of those who died fighting for the Confederacy?
Well, this is a really difficult topic to address, as you can imagine, because it's so polarized right now. I guess my bias is that I approach things from a real historical kind of perspective. And I get the interest in certain statues across the country and certain locations across the country and so on. I mean, I've heard, for example, I believe in Tennessee, they wanted to tear down a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, which I actually be all for. I think Nathan Bedford Forrest is one of the most, notorious and evil people to walk the earth. And I don't need to get into his background, but he was a Confederate general and ruthless on the battlefield, but even more ruthless after the war. So people like that, that's fine. I get it. The issue at Gettysburg, I think you have to kind of unpack it a little bit in terms of the historical perspective of it, and also the narrative that's involved. First of all, there are 1,600 statues and sculptures at Gettysburg. It's the largest display of sculptures in the world, and if you haven't been there, I mean, you would just be fascinated just looking at each of these things, because each one has its own story. There aren't really that many Confederate monuments at Gettysburg, comparatively speaking, a handful. But nonetheless, they kind of provide kind of a part of the narrative that these are the troops who fought here. I mean, if this is what happened and the Union Army was victorious here and changed the fate of the American Civil War, and indeed the fate of our country, well, they weren't fighting against themselves. Let's at least acknowledge who was there. And I bring up a point here, and sometimes this is difficult to talk about also, but the average Confederate soldier, these men who came to Gettysburg, less than 5% of the Confederate Army came from families that held slaves. So it doesn't mean necessarily that I'm kind of brushing off the idea of slavery in the Confederate Army. But historically speaking, the vast majority of Confederate troops really weren't necessarily there to fight to defend the institution of slavery. There were a number of other reasons that they fought the American Civil War. So you can't make light of the slavery situation, and you can't brush that off and say, well, let's not worry about that for now. It's central in the whole story of the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln made sure that it was central in the story of the American Civil War. But I think for those of us who want to interpret history, when you get to a battlefield like Gettysburg, I think you want to be able to say these are the troops that were here, and it would take forever, and we could probably debate this for a number of years forward in terms of how to justify having those memorials still up in various places. But I think on a battlefield itself, I think my opinion, I think it's appropriate to leave these in place because I think I like to be able to tell the story of some of the Confederate troops and what they were doing there, and maybe some background as well. So it's a difficult, it's a really difficult subject right now to discuss because, as I said, we're very polarized. But I think if people can step back and take some of the emotion out of it and start to kind of got a bad thunderstorm coming through here right now. Maybe it's because it didn't like what I had to say about this topic. I don't know. No, but I think obviously I'm not pro Confederacy as such. I am, however, I'm pro warriors who fight in wars, and I think you really have to study a little bit more about the psyche of the Confederate soldier to understand what they were doing in Gettysburg and why there are memorials to them. And I think people whose ancestors fought for the Confederacy, I think, you know, if they come to Gettysburg, I think they want to be able to say, look, this is where they fought, and this is where their markers are. It tells the story and the narrative.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack.
And why we are where we are today. I mean, you know, I know you're right. We're polarized in many things, not just this one topic, but it is good for us to learn from history and not forget the history. And so it helps us, you know, determine where we came from, what we overcame, and where we are today as a nation. So I hope our leaders, you know, can kind of, you know, hone in on that and then say, hey, some of these, like you said, there was a one man that you say probably deserved to be taken down. So, but I agree with you from a historical perspective. I think it should be left alone, and it should be understood and not taken out of context in an emotional fashion. And I get it, and I understand, you know, where that emotion is coming from. You know, I'm a minority myself, so I know where it's coming from. But we have to like calm our nerves, lay back. This is history. This is a part of what we went through and what we fought for to get to where we are today, to not have any more of that. But we have to remind ourselves what we went through. Otherwise, if we erase that from history, we lose what we learned, and that'll be an even sadder situation in my eyes.
I agree. I think if we don't learn from the lessons that took place in our Civil War, we're doomed to maybe allow some of those things to happen again. And I don't mean to be cryptic here, but I mean, I see many parallels in terms of how we're divided as a country. And I think that, as you say, Henry, I hope that our leaders have the wisdom to stop this and bring us all together again, just as Abraham Lincoln sought to do.
Jack, just you know, in the last just few seconds. So, how do people find you? How do they find the book? Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, great. You know, well, they can go to my website. It's battlereadyleadership.com. If you want to find out more about the book, also the program that I do these leadership summits on the Gettysburg battlefield with businesses. The book right now is on Amazon, and it's just Battle Ready Leadership Handbook. So you'll find it there. And it's not War and Peace. I think you'll agree. You could get through it fairly quickly. It's really meant to be a piece that I don't try and do a historical narrative of the Battle of Gettysburg. There are plenty of those out there by some, really brilliant writers. What I try and do is I kind of walk you through the Battle of Gettysburg, but I insert a lot of leadership lessons within that. So I think you can make a lot of notes and do some things that you can take back with you to the office. If you
Exactly.
That's my
awesome.
objective.
So our time's almost up here. So